Great. Okay.
Okay, so now I'm going to have Ted, I would like you to introduce our distinguished speaker and presenter tonight, Missy Dunaway.
Thanks very much, Sandy. I'm honored to introduce our speaker this evening, Missy Dunaway. As you'll know from our program announcements, Missy has embarked on a project to illustrate all of the plus or minus 65 birds mentioned by Shakespeare in his plays and poems. She began this effort about 2 years ago. Her first painting in the series of the barnacle goose was released in early April 2022. I came across the project only late last year and was immediately captivated not only by the beauty of the paintings, but how cleverly they incorporate elements of the bird's habitat and behavior and elements of folklore and superstition about the birds, all the things that prompted Shakespeare to capture them in his work. I knew right away that having Missy discuss her project would be of real interest to our members, and I was thrilled that she accepted our invitation to speak to us this evening on the 460th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth. Missy Dunaway is a 2010 Arts and Humanities graduate of Carnegie Mellon. Among her many awards have been a Folger Institute Fellowship, which supported in part her Shakespeare project, and a Fulbright Fellowship. Missy lives now in southern Maine, a spot that shares the Atlantic Flyway with us here in Westchester. I'm sure some of the birds we're seeing these days will be flying over Missy's home in a few weeks. It's also a place that has inspired some giants of the art world, painters like Winslow Homer and Andrew Wyeth. We're fortunate this evening to have another inspiring, and very talented artist to talk to us about her project. Sandy, would you please turn over the floor to Missy Dunaway?
Okay, Missy, you have the floor.
Okay, great. So I'm sharing my screen. I hope you all see. I'll just get started. So I will get into facts about the birds, because I know talking about birds and learning about birds is why we're all here and why you're a part of the Audubon Society in general. But I just want to start off with a little background about the project, because I always get the same question, which is, how did I come up with the idea? And it actually all came from an argument I had during my undergraduate studies at Carnegie Mellon University back in 2008. I was studying painting, but I had a personal rule that each semester I would use my free elective to take a class in something I had no previous interest in or knowledge of. Of course, I knew a little bit about Shakespeare from high school, but I really was not interested in him. I found him pretty boring and hard to understand. But I thought, if I'm going to go to college and be a college graduate, I want to be well-read, and well-read people know a thing or two about Shakespeare. So I signed up for this class and discovered an enduring and really deep appreciation for his work. And every day after class, I would meet up with a friend of mine who was a computer science major, and we'd get lunch together. And one day our conversation turned to Shakespeare, and Dan said, I just can't get into his work. I think he's boring. He's so complicated. I have no idea what he's saying. And frankly, I think he's overrated. By now, I was fully in love with Shakespeare and I wanted to defend him, but I'm talking to a math guy. So instead of trying to convince him of Shakespeare's artistry or, the depth of his characters and his themes, I thought I should grasp at numbers that could quantify Shakespeare's talent. So I told him, okay, well, Dan, you and I are two average, soon-to-be college American graduates. We have a vocabulary of around 15,000 words. The King James Bible, for reference, has 20,000 unique words. Shakespeare, just what he displays in his 38 plays and sonnets, has a vocabulary of over 30,000 words. 1,100 of those words he either introduced or invented. And then I used birds as an example. I said, just look at how many birds he mentions. He mentions 64 species of birds, and that's just birds. Ted, I know that you had said 65. It was 65, and I took one away recently, so because I decided it was probably the same species. So I've dropped it back down to 64, but it's subject to change. And when I told that to Dan, when I gave that statistic about birds in Shakespeare's work, I thought, oh, that would be a good idea for a painting. So a couple years later, I did a large 8-foot-long painting of feathers from all of Shakespeare's birds. The idea was that the variety of feathers would show his depth of naturalist knowledge, the detail of his imagined world, the variety of the landscapes. And that painting ended up finding a home at the Folger Shakespeare Library. I will circle back to the Folger Shakespeare Library a little bit down the road because they've been a bit of a collaborator with this project. But when I was done with this painting and when it was gone, I was really proud of it, but I also felt vaguely disappointed because I thought, this is a really good idea, and I feel like I haven't studied all that there is. Like, I feel like it could be bigger, but I'm not really sure how. So at the time, I had just accepted a Fulbright fellowship to move to Turkey to study weaving. And so life was taking me in other directions. And I thought, you know what, when the time comes, when I have some free time, I'm going to come back to this project. And COVID gave me that opportunity. It was 10 years later, but I thought, okay, this time, I think the natural expansion of the project would be, instead of one feather for each bird, I'll do one painting for each bird. And I took a lot of inspiration from Audubon. I know we're all appreciators of Audubon's work. One of the things I love the most about his artwork is that he puts so much information about the birds in one immediate image. So you learn more than just what they look like. You also get a sense of their habitat, maybe their nest, offspring, predators sometimes, social behavior. So I really wanted to include that same amount of like lush visual image for my viewer. But I didn't want my work to be too derivative of Shakespeare. I still wanted it to feel fresh and different. So I came up, this is Audubon's depiction of the Carolina turtle dove. And here's my European turtle dove. So this is the basic composition. Even in the artwork behind me, you can see as well, where I have the birds centered in the page, surrounded by a garland border of objects. In the border, I have feathers and eggs that have been carefully scaled and rendered at life size. The eggs are always numbered in average clutch size. I have a plethora of plants that allude to diet, nesting material, habitat. Sometimes the plants will share the same symbolism that the bird has. And then I also include objects, and the objects are direct allusions, as close as I can get, to the symbolism of how the bird appears in the plays. So here in the turtle dove, for example, down in the lower left-hand corner, you see two wedding rings. Those are my wedding bands, because of course the turtle dove represents fidelity and love. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a phoenix feather, a bright red phoenix feather. And that is because the phoenix and the turtle dove are the two titular characters of the Phoenix and the Turtle narrative poem. The phoenix and the turtle are portrayed as two lovers who both die, and all these other birds in the animal kingdom are attending the funeral. It is a really cool poem, and maybe one of the few instances where we actually see a bird play a character. So yeah, really, really fun poem. So the objects I also want to mention. So I have, at the moment, I'm almost at the 50% mark for this project. So I'm coming up on 25. But you'll see some of the other ones, especially the eagle and the crow and the pheasant as well. We see a lot more objects. I am sourcing the objects from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and I'm trying to choose objects that come from as close to Shakespeare as possible. So they're normally from the early modern period, which is 1550 to 1700. And they're either from the British Isles, ideally, or if I can't find something from the British Isles, then from Europe. So again, always coming down like as close as I can to Shakespeare. By the way, these birds right here and these ones as well are all birds that we find in the United States. Throughout this project, throughout this presentation, I mean, I'm going to try to highlight birds from North America. So each of these birds, the project has not gotten boring because they all have such an intense and deep and rich backstory. Each one's really different, and they've all taken me down these different rabbit holes of studying falconry or the Protestant Reformation, folklore, Greek mythology. I mean, it's just been way more than I expected. And so it didn't take me long to realize I am really out of my depth, and I need some help to make sure I can do this project as good as I want it to be. So I thought, well, as politely as possible, I'm just going to email scholars around the world, see if anyone is willing to act as an advisor. That line of inquiry led me back to the Folger Shakespeare Library. They really champion accessibility when it comes to literature, early modern literature, and Shakespeare in particular. So they don't mind that I don't have a PhD and that I'm not a PhD candidate, which has been a bit of an obstacle for other grant opportunities. But they don't mind. They've been so supportive and so generous. So they granted me an artistic research fellowship. They've given me some guidance on where to look in archives to sort of study early modern naturalism. And then they also connected me to Dr. Haley Swenson, who is a Shakespeare scholar specializing in naturalism. Haley is fact-checking my essays that I write about each piece, because each bird I have a painting for, and then also an accompanying essay that acts as a key and illuminates the details of the painting while also summarizing how the bird is used by Shakespeare and appears in the text. So she reads my essays and also counsels how I interpret the text. Then I also met Cody Dean, who is an avian ecologist and ornithologist based in Fairbanks, Alaska. Cody's actually an old friend, but he is checking the anatomy of my bird illustrations and helping me make corrections. And then finally, I brought Harriet Ricks into the mix. Harriet is a botanist in London and Turkey, and Harriet is helping me correct my plant illustrations, because as you can see, plants have started to play a really big role just because there's so many allusions to them in terms of nesting material, habitat, diet. But there was also a very natural crossover between the plants I was using in my paintings and Shakespeare's plants. If you ever read about or have a conversation about naturalism in Shakespeare, the conversation is inevitably going to go to botany, because he had an immense knowledge of botany, and botany plays a huge role in his plays. So I've, just because I like a challenge, decided to make the additional commitment that when I finished all 64-ish paintings, not only will we have all of Shakespeare's birds represented, but also all of the plants. So Harriet is specifically helping me capture how each plant looked in early modern England, because of course, in the subsequent 400 years, especially for ornamental plants, we have cultivated them to adapt to our changing aesthetic tastes. So she's helping me capture how they looked 400 years ago. So as you can tell, this project has, it's become a full-time job. It's a lot of work, really wonderful, fulfilling work. But I'm a fine artist and I support myself through sales of original work. And I can't sell these paintings because they require so many edits, even sometimes a year later. Sometimes when I'm researching, I discover a new little tidbit about a bird and I have to go back to a completed painting and add something in. My advisors as well are very detail-oriented people, which is what I wanted, but they all have a very long list of changes I have to make. So I have to keep all the paintings together. And but how do I support myself in the meantime? So yet again, I looked back to John James Audubon, who had the same problem when he, because his project took about 10 years, and it's looking like mine will be around then as well. So his wife was a huge source of support when he was doing the Birds of America. She supported him through her full-time job in education. She also was a big force in the business side of his project, allowing him to paint full-time and work full-time. But the two of them created this print series where he would sell the prints as they were completed, and then that would fund his work. So I've done the same thing, and I've purposely made my print series as close to Audubon's as possible. So Audubon, from what I understand, he did very large prints so that he could make sure all of his birds are portrayed at life size. I have an ostrich coming up, so I can't do that, but I did make them large enough, close to Audubon size, so that eggs and feathers are life size. And then for the print series, I have done all that I can to make sure that the quality is really high. So I work with a lot of local businesses. My artwork is scanned at the Osher Map Library and Center for Cartographic Research here in Maine. They scan the work. So here you can see on the right is an original painting and on the left is a print. The prints are made at Graffiteria, which is a local business as well. And then they are all, oh, here we go. That's the starling murmuration. I love murmurations. Then they're framed with local maple up in Camden and then shown at the Portland Art Gallery. So again, these are all Maine businesses. Where was I? Oh, yes. So the print series, has been a lot of fun, and it is also a very large part of the project. Here, we're getting a little lost. There we go. Okay. So I've told you a ton about the project, and now let's get straight into the birds, because I know that's what we're all here for. So which play has the most birds? So first, I'll just give a little bit of background. There's 64 birds, and I will give you a hint about which one has the most birds mentioned, because it's my impression so far that we see most of the birds appear in history plays. Because in the history plays, you get a lot of birds in the beginning of the play that have, they're delivering prophecies or omens. Owls are a bad omen. Macbeth is a great example where we have birds that also enact like themes that will eventually come out in the play. In Macbeth, I believe we have a wren that fights off a crow in the text, and that is a reflection of the power inversions that we see through the characters, with Macbeth overthrowing his king, King Duncan. And then we have the noble birds like the eagle and the falcon that represent nobility, military might. Whenever we have kings in a play, there's going to be eagle imagery around. And then, of course, after battles, we get a lot of the carrion birds that show up to feast on the dead. So we have kites, buzzards, vultures, crows, a lot of the carrion birds. So it's my impression that histories are just ripe with opportunities for birds to appear. So yes, I'm sure it's on everyone's mind. The play with the most birds is indeed Henry VI, Part 3, everyone's favorite play. But actually, in all seriousness, Henry VI, Part 2 is my favorite play. The Henry VI series, the trilogy, is fantastic, really underrated. It's a part of the War of the Roses series. But Henry VI, Part 3 also has the biggest word count, so I think it kind of has maybe an unfair advantage when it comes to bird references. So the play with the second most birds mentioned is the one that you're probably thinking, A Midsummer's Night Dream. And that play, coincidentally, is the shortest one, meaning it is the most bird dense, which is, I think, pretty cool. So, all right. So we've looked over birds as a whole. Now let's get into maybe individual birds. So Ted, you had mentioned the barnacle goose. Yep, that was my first one. I did not know I was starting off with such a significant bird. It is actually only mentioned once in The Tempest, which is perfect because The Tempest is a play all about transformation and magic, and the barnacle goose itself is a magical, transformative bird. It was a very significant bird in early modern naturalist circles. So I'm going to use the word naturalist and not scientist, because science in the early modern period, again, that's 1550 to 1700, is in its infancy. It's very different from how it is now. So for lack of a better word, but we'll just go with naturalists. They had all these wacky theories about how barnacle geese reproduced, because as we might know today, the barnacle goose will migrate north up to Svalbard, Greenland, and the Arctic to breed. So they would just migrate back down south, and there's more of them, and where are they coming from? Oh, and here's an illustration of The Tempest. This illustration will be relevant in just a moment. But so one of the first ideas about how they reproduced was that they grew on trees, specifically starting off as the downy buds of a willow tree, which makes sense, I think, because those little pussy willow buds do resemble teeny tiny goslings. There was also an idea that they started off as sea foam that got churned up in the ocean and turned into barnacle geese. And then finally, the most prevalent idea was that they came from barnacles that grew out of rotten driftwood that came from shipwrecks. So again, with that picture we just saw of The Tempest starts with a shipwreck. So how perfect that the barnacle goose appears in this play. Especially with Caliban delivers the line, and he's half man, half fish. And the barnacle goose was believed to be half bird, half fish. So yes, so the reason why the barnacle theory was the most prevalent one is because it was supported by John Gerard, who wrote the Herbal or General History of Plants That was a groundbreaking book on botany of the time, also still very influential today. This book is mainly just a catalog of plants, what they look like, how they grow, where you can find them, medicinal uses. But then in the middle, we have this funny little illustration of barnacle geese and mussels, or not mussels, barnacles. It's specifically the gooseneck barnacle, which is named after the same myth. You can find these barnacles like clustered by the thousands in the Pacific Northwest and also in the northern British Isles. But they're very peculiar looking. They have a very long goose-like neck called a peduncle that allows the barnacle to sort of free float in the water while it's still connected to a rock. It has a feather-like arm. You can see in my illustration up at the top a little bit of a better look. That feather-like arm sort of sweeps food towards it. And then it has this beautiful like black and white scalloped patterning. So all those superficial aesthetic things do kind of remind you of barnacle geese, and maybe you can see how they were related. But John Gerard has an eyewitness account, he says, of watching barnacle geese grow out of barnacles from driftwood from a shipwreck. He might have been making that one up, but it was a very compelling description, and it was a held belief for quite some time. And because of that, the barnacle goose came to epitomize the idea of spontaneous generation, which was pretty significant, I think, in early modern naturalism. It's the idea that living things can be born from and spring from non-living matter. So a very significant bird. And here's my overall painting of the barnacle goose, putting in all of its possible origins along the side, the willow, barnacles, driftwood, and then of course the bird eggs and the feathers. Okay, the kingfisher, one of my favorite birds. I am sure it's also one of your favorite birds. Of course, here in the United States, at least in Maine, we have belted kingfishers. This is a painting of common kingfishers, which we see in England. And the kingfisher also goes by the alternate name of halcyon. So there are a lot of connections between kingfishers and good weather. And if you've ever gone searching to see a kingfisher in person, then you might know why that's the case. Kingfishers perch and look into still water in order to hunt. They dive into the water to capture fish. And for the most efficient hunting, they need sunny skies and clear, placid, still water to see better. So you tend to see kingfishers on sunny, beautiful days. So there was this myth around that the kingfisher itself would attract beautiful weather and conjure pleasant weather. This actually also comes from a Greek myth called Ceyx and Alcyon. I do not know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but there you have it. These are two doomed lovers who died at sea, but the gods admired their love so much they took pity on them, resurrected them, and transformed them into kingfishers. And then furthermore, as a courtesy to the nesting kingfishers, because kingfishers nest at water level, burrowed into tunnels of muddy riverbanks, the gods made sure that when the kingfisher is nesting, they have beautiful weather and calm water. So lots of connections between kingfishers and weather. So in my painting here, we've got the kingfisher eggs in the left-hand side, no nesting material because they nest in tunnels. And then the diving kingfisher is going for 16 minnows. That is the average number of fish that a kingfisher eats in a day. The dragonflies in the border are also a favorite food source. And then the barometer on the right-hand side is the earliest model of a barometer. And the mercury in the shaft indicates favorable weather conditions. Okay, so the dead kingfisher on a string. I'm sure everyone's wondering, yeah, the barometer, Missy, what's that dead kingfisher on a string for? Okay, so that's an allusion to King Lear. It comes from this really kind of beautiful idea that if you have a dead kingfisher and hang it up by a string, its beak will act as a weather vane and point in the direction of the wind. And Kent, who is King Lear's closest ally, gets so frustrated how everyone abandons the king so quickly. He says, I'm paraphrasing, but that people's opinion of the king changes quickly as halcyon beaks in the wind. And so in my painting as well, in the four corners of the composition, I had these 4 compass roses that I have in the bottom here. Each of those compass roses point in the same direction as one of the kingfisher beaks. And then they are also borrowed, the designs are borrowed from the Mariner's Mirror, which is the earliest collection of nautical maps from 1588. And then Evangelista Torricelli is the creator of that barometer. Okay, so the eagle. I am going to just blow right by the eagle, give you just my favorite little bit of folklore about it, because if I were to go into everything about the eagle, that would be the rest of my talk. I could easily just, I mean, you could write a full dissertation on the eagle. We see the eagle appear a lot in terms of representing nobility, Zeus and Jupiter, also military might, powerful leaders. The eagle's all over the place. Very, very significant. But my favorite little bit about the eagle is not mentioned in Shakespeare, but it is a piece of folklore from that time period. I couldn't help myself but include it in my painting. So it has to do with how eagles build their nests. Golden eagles in particular in this scenario. But eagle nests are reused year in year. So they are built up really, really huge. Over the years, they get gigantic. The eagle uses all types of things in the construction of nests, including antlers, really big branches, lichen, all those things that I have in my, is it? Oh, well, yes, here we go. So antlers, branches, all those things included in the nest. But since the nests are reused over and over again, they get really filthy. And the feathers are eaten away by mites. So molted feathers that you find in an eagle nest look really horrific, like what we see in this scan on the left-hand side. So there was a bit of folklore about the eagle that its feathers were acidic and that they were dangerous to the eaglets. And so to protect the eaglets from the acidic feathers, they would get a mythical stone called an atite stone and place it in the nest for protection. So in my painting, even though it's not in Shakespeare, but it is topical to the time period, I put on the right-hand side here, I highlighted the detail, a feather eaten away by mites and one of those mythical stones. Okay, the cuckoo, the big one. There's no way I can talk about Shakespeare and birds and not mention the cuckoo, because you don't have cuckolds without cuckoos. So the cuckoo is the fun-loving bachelor playboy who's fooling around with everyone's wife, and then the cuckolds are the husbands who've been cheated on. They are not actually just victims of infidelity. They're actually people, or birds in this case, who are raising someone else's young without knowing it. Obliviousness and foolishness are paramount to the cuckolds as a character in Shakespeare. It is like a boogeyman that you just see in all types of plays and even outside of Shakespeare. Just from that time period, the cuckold is all over the place. So of course, like it's compared to the cuckoo, or we get it with the cuckoo because that's really how cuckoos, have their young raised. I know I'm talking to a bunch of birders here, so I'm sure you all know about this, but for any novices out there like me, I didn't know about this until I did this project, so I'll just glaze over the details. But the cuckoo is a parasitic bird who lays its egg in the nest of a host, and then those foster parents, without knowing it, are raising a cuckoo chick, believing it to be their own. The cuckoo is a big bird, like a pretty big bird. And strangely enough, it is preying on small birds that are like little songbirds, reed warblers, hedge sparrows, redstarts. So in order to disguise its egg, it lays a very small egg in relation to its size. This small egg also a meaning of the host bird's egg to blend in. So in my painting, I've got 3 different hosts. These are the favorite hosts, at least for the common cuckoo and in Europe, from what I've read. The hedge sparrow or dunnock on the left, with its cuckoo egg that's speckled to match that, and then the redstart in the middle with the like pearly egg, and then a reed warbler. So the little egg, the cuckoo chick, has a very short gestation period. So it hatches before all the other chicks. And even though it's blind and completely helpless by instinct alone, it rolls out the other chicks from the nest, kills all of its siblings. So it's the only one left. Then the cuckoo chick grows amazingly fast, and it has a very big, like unusually big mouth that's bright red. And the idea is that its mouth is really big in order to appear to be many mouths instead of just the one. So they are kind of monstrous and terrifying. So it's no wonder that the cuckoo is like the origin of so many folk tales. I mean, this was like a really dense bird to study. It's not all bad though. So in my painting here, this is one of the only ones where I include other bird species in the composition, but it seemed really necessary to the story. And then you'll see that oh, right. So just a quick anecdote about cuckolds in Shakespeare. We see a lot of cuckoo and cuckold imagery in Othello, of course, because infidelity is a really big theme in that play, and jealousy. But Othello, I always feel a little bit bad for him because he had a villain, Iago, conspiring against him and his wife, trying to break them up. He had a reason to be suspicious because there's somebody there planting evidence. Leontes, however, in The Winter's Tale, which we see right here, he very strangely, in the first act of The Winter's Tale, out of the blue, with no reason at all, in a happy marriage, he just becomes obsessed with the idea that his wife is cheating on him, so he rejects his newborn baby. So Leontes in general, when he talks, he has a lot of cuckoo imagery. He also talks about horns because it's the idea that a cuckold would grow horns. Again, everyone can see what's obvious except him, like the person with horns can't see. So, and this is, I thought, just a great illustration found in the Folger Shakespeare Library's collection. But like I said, it's not all bad with the cuckoo. The cuckoo is fascinating because it is, like I said, a boogeyman, but then it's also the first sign of spring. And so there's a lot of celebration going on about the cuckoo because its song was seen as this magical bringer of spring. So I actually have a video I'd like to share of a song. It's just a minute and a half called Summer is a Comin' In. It's from the Wessex dialect of Middle English, and it's one of the earliest recorded songs, I believe, in English. And but they mimic the cuckoo's call in the song, and it's really beautiful. So I am just going to stop my share for just a moment and share a different screen. Just a moment here. Bear with me. Okay, there we go. Nope, nope, nope. Here we are. I was humming it today because I was listening to it in preparation for this. It's really beautiful. Here we go.
Sing cuckoo no, sing cuckoo no, sing cuckoo no, sing cuckoo no. Summer is a coming to sing cuckoo. Crow has said and blood men sing the waterloo. Sing cuckoo, our better got along about the allegorical. Juliette and book and the toy sing cuckoo. Cuckoo, cuckoo, sing the cuckoo, never sing the love. Summer is a comedy, summer is a comedy, summer is a comedy, summer is a comedy. Sing the waterloo, 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 and the sun is in the cuckoo. Sing the waterloo, sing the waterloo, summer is a comedy, summer is a comedy, summer is a comedy, summer is a comedy. Sing the waterloo, 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 and the sun is in the cuckoo. Sing the waterloo, sing the waterloo, sing the cuckoo, sing the cuckoo, sing the la-la-loo, sing cuckoo.
Okay, now back to the other. Okay, there we go. Okay, isn't that a lovely song? It's so pretty. Wish it was longer. Okay, so the cuckoo as well. Lots going on with the cuckoo, but it's another significant bird that's really studied when it comes to Shakespeare's birds. The most important text written about this subject is by James Edmund Harding with the Birds of Shakespeare, published in the late 1800s. And he illuminated this line in particular in King Lear. The fool mentions the hedge sparrow in particular, saying, although my painting right here is a reed warbler, but imagine it's a hedge sparrow, saying that basically warning the king to be suspicious of his daughters and not to give his daughters too much power, comparing it to the cuckoo and the hedge sparrow, saying the hedge sparrow fed the cuckoo so much that the cuckoo became this huge monster and gobbled up his parents, which of course is not far from what happens in King Lear. And so I think I had mentioned that I've been writing an essay about each of these birds. And when it comes to the cuckoo, in my first draft of my essay about it, I mention this line, and I say that this line in particular shows, if not maybe proves, that Shakespeare himself was a birder, because the favorite host of the cuckoo, being the dunnock, the redstart, and the reed warbler, were not common knowledge. So the fact that Shakespeare correctly attributes the hedge sparrow or the dunnock as one of the foster parents shows that he probably gleaned that from in-person observation. So my Shakespeare advisor, Dr. Haley Swenson, when she read that, she pointed it out and she said, now, how do you know that no one else from that time period knew that cuckoos prey on hedge sparrows? And I said, well, that's what my references said. And she said, okay, and what are your primary references for this project? And I said, well, my favorite book is The Birds of Shakespeare by James Edmund Harding. And she said, and when was that published? And I said, 1871. And she goes, I thought so, because you write like an old man from the 1800s. Which was a big surprise to me because I'm a painter, I'm confident in my painting, I am not a writer, I am really out of my depth and out of my comfort zone with this project, writing so much. And this whole time I've been worried that Haley is going to say, Missy, you write like a high schooler, you got to pick it up. So you can imagine my surprise when she said I wrote like a man from the 1800s. And when I asked her what she meant, she said, well, your writing is perpetuating prejudices that were prevalent in academia in the 1800s. Another head scratcher. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? Like, I'm writing about birds, and I thought birds were like one of the least controversial things I could talk about. And she said, well, because knowledge is foundational and we are always building on our knowledge of the past, there was this real attitude that you see in writing, academic writing from the 1800s, that we today, we know more and we are smart. People of the past, they are dumb, they know less, that sort of thing. And she told me, which I think is a really good thing for all of us to remember when we're reading old texts, that texts don't always record facts, but they do record values. And the fact that writing from the early modern period has a lot of folklore in it, it might be because the folklore is what's more important there. And just because no one else writes about the hedge sparrow's relationship with the cuckoo doesn't mean that it's already common knowledge. Maybe the knowledge is so common and that's why no one even thought to write it down. Because there is something to be said for if Shakespeare is writing about birds so much and including bird imagery and behavior in his writing so much, he would have to assume that his audience knows those things for those jokes to land and for the allusions to really have an impact. Because when you think about it, nature in the early modern period was much more abundant, and the lives of people was much more enmeshed with the lives of birds, both domestic and wild. So that brings us to the big question, was Shakespeare a birder? Well, if we're going by what James Edmund Harding says, who's really kind of like with this topic, he's the expert, although a little dated, I suppose. He says yes, Shakespeare demonstrates so much information and knowledge about birds and falconry in particular. There's very good evidence that he was a birder, and also very strong evidence that he was in falconry. But then we have a more contemporary resource, Dr. Rebecca Ann Bach, who teaches Shakespeare studies and animal studies at the University of Alabama. She says, no, Shakespeare, yes, he knew a lot about birds, but everybody did. So he's nothing special. And, if he had a lot of knowledge about birds, it was probably passively obtained and not actively sought. So we can't really picture him spending hours out with his old-timey binoculars in a field, which is how I always kind of pictured him when I was painting. And she wrote this fantastic book on the right, Birds and Other Creatures in Renaissance Literature, and then that fuzzy subtitle is Shakespeare, Descartes, and Animal Studies. I cannot recommend this book enough. It is so good, and it has really changed how I view the relationship between people and animals, especially in the early modern and Renaissance time. I will just quickly summarize some of her really good arguments in this book, just because I'm sure all of us in the audience are not only bird lovers, but animal lovers, so I think you'll probably appreciate this. But I never thought that much about the division between humans and animals on a philosophical level. But Rebecca Ann Bach, she illuminates that division between humans and animals didn't really come around until Descartes in the mid-1600s. And before Descartes, everyone, humans and animals, everyone was considered a creature because we were all created by God. And Descartes was the first person to say, no, like humans are totally different. We are only created in God's image. All the other animals, they lack our special qualities. They do not have emotion, intellect, personality. They are machines. And that division between humans and animals is really what has persisted, perhaps because it taps into human grandiosity. Everyone likes to hear that they're special. Also because as time has passed, nature and human life has been a little bit more separated, and it's very easy to generalize something you don't know. So yeah, I didn't realize how new that understanding of animals and birds and people were. And so when I understood that Shakespeare probably didn't approach animals in the same way, and he viewed birds much more individualistically, then you can understand how each bird has really its own deep personality that's created through folklore. The relationships between people and birds is really rich. People had personal relationships with birds. I think that's what I'm trying to get across. So anyway, check this book out. It just gets better and better from there. Okay, so the big question, everyone's wondering. Everyone loves to ask me about this question the minute I say, oh, I'm painting about Shakespeare's birds. And then, yeah, the question of Eugene Schieffelin comes up. Is it true that he brought over 100 starlings to Central Park in the early 1900s? Yes, that is true. Did he do it because he wanted to bring over every bird mentioned by Shakespeare? No, that part is not true, and I stand by it, and I shall explain now. So here's my painting of the starling. I first heard about this myth shortly after I graduated college, and even when I heard it, I thought, okay, so he wanted to bring over every bird mentioned by Shakespeare. There are a lot of birds mentioned by Shakespeare that aren't in North America, most of them actually. So what else did he bring over if this was his life's mission? I've only heard about the starling, and also the house sparrow is another one he did. And that was it. And I was like, well, if that's his life's mission and he only did 2, I'm a little disappointed. And so I looked it up online, and I found a lot of reputable sources that mention this legend, including the New York Times and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I thought, surely someone must have a direct quote from the man himself, and nobody did. And when they did cite, if they did a citation, which most of them did not, but if they did a citation, they were just citing each other. And no one was citing back to Eugene Schieffelin himself, which I also thought was a little suspicious. So then I thought, well, how far back can we go to get a document from this man saying anything about Shakespeare? The closest I could get was his obituary. And right, so his obituary goes into a lot of details about his interests. He was a pharmacist. He was really into genealogy. He was a part of the American Acclimatization Society. The American Acclimatization Society was actually a part of a global community of clubs that traded plant and animal species and bird species in between continents. The idea was that they were promoting biodiversity, very tragic idea because, of course, it's the opposite. When you introduce a new species to a brand new environment, it can often have a detrimental effect. But then also on top of that, they wanted to study evolutionary biology. And so they figured if they brought in a new species to a brand new environment, they could observe how it either failed or flourished and see how it adapted to a new environment. So he wasn't the only one doing this. A lot of people were doing it. But so the obituary also says he really likes gardening, and it confirms the starling release and the house sparrow. But how peculiar that it mentions all of those things, goes into detail about his interests, but never mentions Shakespeare or even theater. So when is the first time that like the Shakespeare intention was ever tied to Eugene Schieffelin? Okay, so I got as far as the obituary. That's when I gave up. Lauren Fugate and John McNeill Miller, Lauren Fugate's from my alma mater, Carnegie Mellon, they broke the story wide open in one of the most satisfying reads I've ever had, Shakespeare's Starlings, and they found the first time that the Shakespeare intention was ever tied to Eugene Schieffelin. So I'm just going to paraphrase that article, but I do highly recommend that you read it because it is a really good read. So the first time that it was ever mentioned was by Edwin Way Teale in the 1947. So he just mentioned it as fact in a magazine article. And so he states it very confidently in the magazine. But those two researchers that I mentioned, they found his unpublished notes for that article. And in the unpublished notes, Edwin Way Teale had even said that he himself was skeptical on the idea and it was just an idea. And he was actually correlating two trendy things in the naturalist circles of his time. So first, American Acclimatization Society, trading plant and animal species, introducing new birds to North America. That was one trend during Eugene Schieffelin's lifetime. The other trend was Shakespeare commemorative gardens, Shakespeare gardens, where we have a garden and you plant all of Shakespeare's plants. So there is a Shakespeare garden in Central Park where Eugene Schieffelin released the starlings. However, that park was constructed after Eugene Schieffelin's death, so it's not really, they don't line up perfectly, but close enough that he was saying, well, these two things were popular at the same time, so maybe that's why he did it. So that's where the first mention of it comes from. But could this really popular urban legend spring from this line from a naturalist magazine in the 1940s? Probably not, but that's where we get Robert Cantwell. Robert Cantwell was a very talented writer, a flair for fiction, apparently, who wrote for Sports Illustrated, and he extrapolated that story and made it into something that really captured the imagination of the American public. So he took Eugene Schieffelin, and instead of an elderly pharmacist, he recast him as, I kind of picture this like Great Gatsby character who's handsome and aristocratic, and he's eccentric and he loves the theater. So his Eugene Schieffelin was really a work of fiction, but that's the one that took hold and that's the one that we think about. But it was a work of fiction. So, well, I hope I addressed that question enough to satisfy people who are watching. And I know that the starling is controversial for other reasons beyond why it was introduced to the US, including whether or not it was invasive. So I could go on about the starling, but I figure we might as well open up to the Q&A, and I'm happy to continue talking if anyone has any questions. But thank you so much for listening to me talk for this long, because it's a lot of talking, but it's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Okay, so Missy, that was fantastic. And you know, my project, as most people know, is bluebirds, and I have to change my talk that I've given hundreds and hundreds of times. The enemy of the bluebird is the house sparrow and starling, and the starling's here because 50 were released in Central Park because they wanted all the birds in Shakespeare, and it's only mentioned once in King Henry IV or something like. Anyway, I have to take that out of my talk. It's mentioned twice. Okay, whatever. Even I had that wrong. So thank you for getting to the bottom of all that, and I've been lying all these years. So sorry. So it
Oh
was
no,
fantastic.
it was mentioned just once. You were right, but in
King Henry the
IV
Fourth, right? Nay, nor a
Yeah.
starling I'll make of you, or something like that. Nay, I'll make you a starling, or
Yeah, Hotspur will train a starling to shout. Oh my gosh, I'm forgetting it.
Mortimer or something. Mortimer,
Name, blah, blah, blah.
Mortimer. Is it Mortimer?
Mortimer,
Maybe
yes.
Mortimer. Anyway. Anyway, thank you so much. You are so bright. You know more for not even knowing Shakespeare. I mean, I'm the camp that I can't figure out Shakespeare. And not only did you figured it out, you've made a career of it. It's fantastic. I'm just amazed.
I think it's just a full-time hobby at this point.
Right.
At
I
this
know.
point.
I don't think it's
Thank
wonderful.
you.
I want to ask another quick thing about your prints. Can we buy those prints? Is that go on your website and buy the
Yes.
prints? So you said you can't let go of some paintings, but you can let go of prints? What? I didn't get that.
That's right. So each painting I have is a limited edition print in a series of 75. They are at the Portland Art Gallery, and you can also email me, Missy Dunaway at gmail.com, go to thebirdsofshakespeare.com or portlandartgallery.com. Lots of
So get a
places to
print
find
to
it.
get a print, but your
To get a
overall
print.
painting, the official painting is not released, right? You said.
No, I don't think they ever will be. I'm kind of hoping that the collection as a whole will find a home in either a library or a
Okay,
museum.
got it.
But that's years away. So,
Yeah.
but
Sandy,
yeah.
I'm sorry. We have a few questions in the chat, and
Okay.
Arabella has her hand raised. If you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, Arabella.
Well, thank you. First of all, that was really good, and you're so talented.
Thank you.
I also say you mentioned that the cuckoos that they tend to parasitize these three species, the reed warbler, hedge sparrow, and the other one. So do the cuckoos do certain cuckoos specialize in parasitizing a certain species? Because if you also mentioned that the cuckoo's eggs match the other species' eggs. So how does that work? Thank you.
Yeah, bizarre, isn't it? Okay, so there are many types of cuckoos. I have read up on the common cuckoo. So my those facts might be limited to just that type of cuckoo, but from what I hear, they can prey on other types of birds beyond those three. Those three are just like the favorites, and they will choose one species for the season. And that's the one that they will, that I don't know if it's the individual bird or if they're all in on it together. I imagine it's probably the individual bird. But from what I understand, each season it will probably choose a new host, and then the egg will match that host egg. But fascinating, isn't it? Weird. Yeah.
Missy, a lot of thanks and praise for your presentation in the chat. A few questions as well. One is, what medium are you painting in?
Oh, I paint with acrylic ink on paper. Actually, the originals are behind me right now, but the acrylic ink, oh, here I have a jar of it. So it's primarily a fluid ink medium, but if you've ever painted with ink, then you probably know that it's a very fugitive medium that can fade out very quickly in sunlight and direct sunlight. So ink is often very popular with illustrators who scan their work directly into a computer. But since my work is on display, the originals are on display in sunlight, I have to use something more stable. So the acrylic element in the ink is really just to make it archival, to make sure that it doesn't fade in sunlight. But primarily it's ink on paper.
And there's a question, is there a book in the future?
Oh, yes, that's a dream. I have published one other book before. I have it. So it's a totally different topic. It's called The Traveling Artist, a Visual Journal, but it's a collection of paintings depicting 10 years of international travel. But it's so very different. But I would love to make the Birds of Shakespeare a book as well. But I'm trying to get to the 50% mark before I get that ball in motion. So
there's a question, which has been your favorite bird to research and paint?
the cuckoo is the most entertaining. That's a weird one. But I think it was maybe the kingfisher. They've all been really interesting, and I love how they also have relationships to each other. That's, I was reading about the eagle and then it ties in with the wren. So I'm doing the wren next, but they kind of have a relationship. So sometimes it's the relationship between the birds that I like the most. Although the pelican, so I haven't painted the pelican yet, but it's on my docket for the year. I have like a schedule. There is a belief that the pelican would feed its young by stabbing itself in the breast and feeding its young with its own blood. It's just like so strange. And yeah, I actually had a baby almost 5 months ago. So not that I mean, just that story of like how it feeds its young, and I don't know. Yeah, so the pelican has been interesting, but I'd say at this point probably the kingfisher. Yeah.
And also, there's a question if you could just repeat which gallery shows your work in Portland, Maine.
That is Portland Art Gallery in the Old Port, so portlandartgallery.com. And actually, let me just pull up, I'll share my screen one more time to my contact page so you can see my email and that's my project website, but it has information for the gallery on there as well. And then you can also just inquire with me. Yeah.
Great, thank you. That's pretty much it for questions in the chat. I don't know if anyone else wants to unmute.
Hi, Maria, it's Ted again.
Yep.
I was just going to say, because Missy didn't, that you can sign up, I think, Missy, on your homepage as a quote unquote subscriber. And so whenever you issue a new painting, you get a notification in your inbox and you can see the painting and you can read about, the essay that you've written about the bird and where it crops up in Shakespeare. But I think the last one that I saw, which is actually the first one that I saw, because I think you took a bit of time off when you were having your baby. But the last one I saw was, I think, the peregrine, right?
Yes, that's right. The peregrine falcon,
And
which I've got behind me, right? This one.
yes,
Yeah.
and I have to tell you, the material that you see when you release the painting, at least in that case, you had videos of the peregrine hunting in a place in England. And I mean, the material that comes along with the painting when you're a subscriber is really impressive and fascinating. So I would encourage everybody on the chat to, or on the presentation, to become a subscriber, and it's free and it's just fascinating. And so again, thank you very much. It's been really entertaining.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to admit I despise newsletters. I always unsubscribe. So I thought if I'm going to make my own newsletter, I'm going to make it as good as I can and try to make it as entertaining and enriching. So yeah, there's a lot of information on the newsletter. I send one a month for one bird a month. But I include a lot of like video, like what Ted said, additional supplementary information that's not on the website. So it just offers a little something different. And I like to think that it's a pretty entertaining read that pops into your inbox. So I promise I don't spam you.
I saw Rosemary had her hand up.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I thank you, Missy, because I love Shakespeare and I love birds, but this has given me a whole new way to look at Shakespeare and read the stories and see the plays again. So I appreciate it. I'll keep more in mind all the different aspects besides, those stories. But I wanted to mention to you that your bird paintings are so beautiful, that the Cropsey Museum in Hastings it's a beautiful privately owned site, a historic building, and it's called the Cropsey Museum in Hastings on Hudson, New York. Every year they have an exhibit of birds, and I think your work would be fantastic to be shown there. They have artists from around the country depicting birds. That's their theme at the Cropsey. So please look into it. I think your work would be beautiful there. I've been to their exhibits a number of times.
I just typed it down. So yes,
All right.
I will check it out. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
So this was going to be recorded because they came in late, and it will be it is been being recorded, and it's on our website. It will be on our website. Give us a few days. And I actually have a question. Have you read all of Shakespeare? You are so knowledgeable. You
I have
started in
gotten
college.
through, gosh, how many have I done? I think I have, there's 38 plays and I've read all but 11. I have not read the comedies because I don't like the comedies. I've read some of the comedies, but I've saved them for last. Yeah, the histories are my favorite. Just the fact that they're labeled histories, I think gives them a bad rep immediately because they sound like a lesson and not entertainment. But what I love about the histories is that they have all the genres in one. There's always romance and action and drama. I mean, they've got it all going on. So yeah, if you want to get back into Shakespeare or explore it, I would say start with Richard II. That's the beginning of the War of the Roses series. And then the Henry VI trilogy, especially part 2 and 3, is amazing. Henry VI part 1 was actually a prequel that was written after the fact, and it's okay. But yeah, I do love reading and watching Shakespeare.
So I assume that somebody else told you that there are 64 birds mentioned, right? So did you get
Yes,
the list of the books, the birds, and like, okay, I need to do this, I need to read those things for sure.
Oh,
And none of those birds are in the comedy? How's that work?
I had some help from James Edmund Harding, who wrote the book, The Birds of Shakespeare from 1871. So he really did all the legwork of going through the plays and picking out the references.
Okay.
So his book was the starting point and also provided the list. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But
Okay.
I do go back to read the plays to sort of confirm it and then also read it for context so I understand the real context of how the bird is used.
Right. Okay. Anybody else have any more questions? This has been fantastic. We can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
And I just moved to a new house and I'm trying to find a blank wall here. Well, all the walls are blank right now. So anyway, maybe one of your paintings will find a way on one of my walls because I'm very inspired.
Thank you. I'm reading all the
okay.
messages now on the side. Thank you so much for everyone for your kind words.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we're going to conclude right now. And can you just stay on just right at the end a little bit, Missy, 1 second when everybody else say good night?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Everybody else say goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay. All right. Let me just see something here. Not everybody's might be gone, but would we do such a compensation and honorarium? Is that ever brought up? Because the people who lined you up, Aaron is now not with us. Do we talk about that?
We can.
Well, okay, we'll talk separately.
Okay.
Okay, that's probably a good idea. I think maybe Leslie, who also was in on the lining up, but you were fantastic. Awesome how much you know. Your art is so beautiful, and we can't thank you enough. Okay, and how's old baby? A little girl, little boy?
Oh, darn, I missed that question about the turkey.
What was it? Well, what's the question? Well,
there was that. Yeah, at the end, I just saw that as we got out. That was the turkey was a New World bird.
Yeah, the turkey had been introduced by then. And it's really funny. I should have reread what I wrote about the turkey as a refresher. But Shakespeare, when I picture Shakespeare, I think of so far in the past, but he was writing when North America was being colonized. So turkeys were coming over, to England for sale from the New World. Yeah, and up until then, peacocks were seen as like the fancy bird that would be on for royal feasts. But then the new turkey ended up being the fancy bird. So they were wandering around like noble estates as status symbols. They were included in really fancy meals. But because turkeys lay so many eggs, they actually ended up becoming a very popular common dinner as well at Christmas time. Because they were so easy to domesticate and breed. So they became commonplace really quickly. Yeah.
I'm gonna actually stop the recording right now. I just realized I should have done that. And I think actually we'll say goodnight. We ready to say goodnight, and I'll communicate back with you. Okay?
Thanks.
Okay,
Once
great.
again,
That sounds
thank
great.
you so much. Thank Maria for being the backup there.
Thank
you,
no
Maria.
problem. It's
Because on
great.
my screen, I didn't. Okay. All
Bye-bye.
right. Everybody, thank you so much. Good night.
Okay, good night.